The story of the Titanic has captivated our collective imagination for over a century. The unsinkable ship that met its tragic fate on its maiden voyage has become the stuff of legend, immortalized in countless books, documentaries, and of course James Cameron's blockbuster film. But what if the narrative we've all come to accept, that an iceberg was solely responsible for sending 1,500 souls to their watery graves, isn't the complete truth? What if there were other factors at play, factors that have been overshadowed by the dramatic image of a massive ship colliding with an iceberg in the North Atlantic? Today, we're diving deep into one of the most compelling alternative theories about the Titanic disaster, the coal bunker fire that may have been burning for days before the Shipbuilder left Southampton. This isn't just some fringe conspiracy theory. It's a hypothesis backed by photographic evidence, survivor testimonies, and modern scientific analysis. And it suggests that the Titanic was doomed before it ever hit that iceberg. Let's start with what we know for certain. On April 10, 1912, the RMS Titanic departed Southampton on its maiden voyage to New York. 4 days later, at 11:40 p.m. ship's time on April 14th, it struck an iceberg and began taking on water. By 2:20 a.m. on April 15th, the ship had broken apart and sunk, resulting in the deaths of more than 1,500 passengers and crew. These are the basic facts that no one disputes. But here's where things get interesting. In 2017, a documentary called Titanic, The New Evidence, presented compelling photographic evidence of a bunker fire that had been burning in the ship for days, possibly even weeks, before the Titanic set sail. The documentary featured analysis by journalist Sen and Moloney, who had spent more than 30 years researching the disaster. Moloney discovered photographs taken by the ship's chief electrical engineer before it left the Belfast shipyard. These photos show a 30-foot-long black mark on the hull, right where the iceberg would later strike. According to experts consulted for the documentary, this mark was likely caused by a fire in one of the ship's coal bunkers, a fire that could have reached temperatures of up to 1,000 degrees Celsius. Now, coal bunker fires weren't uncommon on ships of that era. Coal, when stored in large quantities, can spontaneously combust due to chemical reactions. But what makes this particular fire significant is its location and duration. The fire was allegedly burning in Boiler Room 6, precisely where the iceberg would later strike the ship. And according to some accounts, it had been burning since the ship left Belfast for Southampton, possibly even earlier. But if there was a fire on board, why wasn't it extinguished before the ship departed? Well, that's where the human element of this tragedy comes into play. The White Star Line, the company that owned the Titanic, was under immense pressure to launch the ship on schedule. The Titanic was not just a ship, it was a symbol of British industrial might and technological prowess. Delaying its maiden voyage would have been a public relations disaster and a financial setback. So instead of delaying the voyage to properly address the fire, the decision was made to manage it as best as possible while keeping the ship on schedule. A team of stokers was assigned to continuously shovel coal from the burning bunker into the furnaces, both to use up the fuel before it could further feed the fire and to maintain the ship's speed. But here's where the fire theory gets truly chilling. Modern metallurgical analysis suggests that a coal bunker fire of the intensity described could have significantly weakened the steel hull of the Titanic. When steel is exposed to extreme heat and then rapidly cooled, as would have happened when the iceberg's freezing temperature came into contact with the fire-weakened hull, it becomes brittle and prone to fracture. This phenomenon, known as thermal shock, could explain why the Titanic's hull plates separated on impact rather than merely denting, as would be expected from a collision with an iceberg. There's also survivor testimony that supports the fire theory. Several crew members, including fireman John Dilley and second engineer John Hesketh, later testified that they were aware of the fire. Hesketh even stated that the fire had been burning for days and that a group of men had been fighting it since the ship left Southampton. But perhaps the most damning piece of evidence comes from the testimony of 4th Officer Joseph Boxall. During the British inquiry into the disaster, Boxall testified that after the collision, he went to inspect the damage and found that water was entering the ship at a point where the hull plates had separated from the frames. This is consistent with the theory that the steel had been weakened by the fire and then failed catastrophically when it came into contact with the iceberg. Now, it's important to note that the coal bunker fire theory doesn't completely absolve the other factors that contributed to the disaster. The ship was still traveling too fast for the conditions. The lookouts still didn't have binoculars. There were still too few lifeboats for the number of people on board. But what the fire theory suggests is that these weren't just unfortunate circumstances or poor decisions. They were part of a cascade of failures that began with the decision to sail a ship with a known fire on board. The fire theory also adds a new dimension to our understanding of the disaster. It's not just the story of hubris, of humans believing they could build an unsinkable ship, but also a story of corporate pressure and the willingness to take risks with human lives for the sake of profit and reputation. But why hasn't this theory received more attention until recently? Part of the reason might be that the White Star Line had a vested interest in downplaying the fire. In the aftermath of the disaster, they faced potential legal liability and damage to their reputation. It was in their interest to focus on the iceberg as the sole cause of the disaster rather than acknowledge that they had knowingly sailed a ship with a dangerous fire on board. Additionally, the dramatic narrative of the unsinkable ship being brought down by an iceberg is simply a more compelling story than a complex interplay of factors, including a coal bunker fire. It's a cleaner narrative, one that's easier to tell and to understand. But history is rarely clean or simple. The truth is often messy, complicated, and involves multiple factors coming together in just the wrong way to create disaster. And that seems to be the case with the Titanic. So what does this mean for our understanding of the Titanic disaster? It means that we need to reconsider the narrative we've accepted for over a century. The iceberg wasn't solely responsible for the sinking of the Titanic. It was the final blow to a ship that was already compromised by a fire that had been burning for days. It also means that the disaster wasn't just a result of natural forces beyond human control. It was, at least in part, the result of human decisions to sail despite the fire, to maintain speed despite the ice warnings, to carry too few lifeboats despite the risk. These were all choices made by humans, choices that had catastrophic consequences. But the fire theory also raises uncomfortable questions about corporate responsibility and the prioritization of profit over safety. If the White Star Line knew about the fire, and the evidence suggests they did, then their decision to sail anyway represents a profound moral failure. It's a failure that cost 1,500 people their lives. Of course, it's easy for us to judge these decisions with the benefit of hindsight. We know how the story ends. But for the people making these decisions in 1912, the future was uncertain. They were balancing competing priorities, safety, schedule, reputation, profit, without knowing which decisions would prove fatal. And that's perhaps the most important lesson we can take from the Titanic disaster, especially in light of the fire theory. It's not just about the specific failures that led to this particular disaster. It's about the broader pattern of how we make decisions under uncertainty, how we balance competing priorities, and how we assess and respond to risk. Because the truth is, we're still making these kinds of decisions today. We're still balancing safety against other priorities. We're still assessing and responding to risks. And we're still sometimes getting it wrong, with catastrophic consequences. Think about recent disasters like the Boeing 737 MAX crashes, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, or the Fukushima nuclear disaster. In each case, there were warning signs that were ignored, risks that were downplayed, and decisions that prioritized other factors over safety. And in each case, people died as a result. So perhaps the most important thing we can learn from the Titanic disaster, and from the coal bunker fire theory in particular, is not just about what went wrong on that specific night in April 1912. It's about the patterns of decision-making that can lead to disaster, and about the importance of prioritizing safety even when it's inconvenient or costly. Because at the end of the day, the Titanic disaster wasn't just a failure of technology or a cruel twist of fate. It was a failure of human decision-making, a failure to properly assess and respond to risk, and a failure to prioritize the safety of the people on board above all else. And that's a lesson we would do well to remember, not just when we're telling the story of the Titanic, but when we're making our own decisions about risk and safety in the modern world. Now, let's take a moment to consider some of the other factors that contributed to the Titanic disaster beyond the coal bunker fire and the iceberg. One factor was the ship's speed. Despite receiving multiple warnings about ice in the area, Captain Edward Smith maintained a speed of 22 knots, just 2 knots shy of the ship's maximum speed. This decision has been the subject of much debate. Some argue that Smith was trying to set a speed record for the crossing, while others suggest he was simply following standard practice for clear weather conditions. Regardless of the reason, the high speed meant that when the iceberg was finally spotted, there wasn't enough time to avoid a collision. Another factor was the lack of binoculars for the lookouts. The ship's second officer, David Blair, had been replaced at the last minute and forgot to hand over the key to the locker containing the binoculars for the crow's nest. As a result, the lookouts were forced to rely on their naked eyes to spot hazards. While it's impossible to say for certain, it's reasonable to think that binoculars might have allowed the lookouts to spot the iceberg earlier, giving the ship more time to maneuver. Then there's the issue of the lifeboats. The Titanic carried only 20 lifeboats, enough for about 1,178 people, far fewer than the 2,208 people on board. This wasn't due to oversight or negligence, it was a deliberate decision. The ship was designed to carry 64 lifeboats, but the number was reduced to 20 to avoid cluttering the deck. At the time, this was legal. The regulations were based on a ship's tonnage, not its passenger capacity, but it proved to be a fatal flaw in the ship's design. And let's not forget the wireless operators. The Titanic's wireless operators received multiple ice warnings throughout the day of the disaster, but not all of these warnings were passed on to the bridge. The operators were primarily employed to send and receive messages for passengers, and ice warnings were considered a lower priority. The final ice warning, received just before the collision, was never delivered because the operator was busy clearing a backlog of passenger messages. Each of these factors, the speed, the missing binoculars, the insufficient lifeboats, the undelivered ice warnings, contributed to the disaster. And when we add the coal bunker fire to this list, we get a more complete picture of the cascade of failures that led to the sinking of the Titanic. But there's one more factor that's often overlooked: the weather conditions on the night of the disaster. The sea was unusually calm, so calm that it's been described as like glass. This might seem like a good thing, but it actually made it harder for the lookouts to spot the iceberg. Without waves breaking against the base of the iceberg, it was nearly invisible against the dark night sky. Additionally, there was no moon that night, further reducing visibility. So when we consider all these factors together, the fire weakening the hull, the high speed, the lack of binoculars, the insufficient lifeboats, the undelivered ice warnings, and the unusually calm sea, we can see that the Titanic disaster wasn't just bad luck. It was the result of a perfect storm of factors, each one contributing to the ultimate catastrophe. And that's what makes the Titanic disaster so fascinating and so tragic. It wasn't just one thing that went wrong, it was everything. It was a cascade of failures, a chain of events that, had any one of them been different, might have changed the outcome. But of all these factors, the coal bunker fire is perhaps the most intriguing because it suggests that the Titanic was compromised before it ever left port. It suggests that the ship, celebrated as unsinkable, was sailing with a fatal flaw that would ultimately contribute to its demise. And that's a sobering thought. It reminds us that no matter how advanced our technology, no matter how confident we are in our creations, we are still vulnerable to the unexpected, to the overlooked, to the risks we choose to ignore. So, as we continue to tell the story of the Titanic, let's remember not just the iceberg, but all the factors that contributed to the disaster. Let's remember the coal bunker fire, the high speed, the missing binoculars, the insufficient lifeboats, the undelivered ice warnings, and the calm sea. And let's remember the human decisions that allowed these factors to align in just the wrong way to create one of the most famous disasters in history. Because only by understanding the full complexity of the Titanic disaster can we hope to learn from it and prevent similar tragedies in the future. And that, perhaps, is the most important legacy of the Titanic, not just as a cautionary tale of hubris, but as a complex case study in how multiple factors can come together to create disaster, and how human decisions can either mitigate or exacerbate those factors. So the next time you think about the Titanic, remember that it wasn't just an iceberg that sank the unsinkable ship. It was a complex interplay of factors, including a fire that had been burning for days, weakening the very spot where the iceberg would strike. And remember that behind each of these factors were human decisions that, with the benefit of hindsight, we can see were tragically flawed. But also remember that we're still making these kinds of decisions today. We're still balancing safety against other priorities. We're still assessing and responding to risks. And we're still sometimes getting it wrong. So perhaps the most important thing we can learn from the Titanic disaster is not just about what went wrong on that specific night in April 1912, but about how we make decisions under uncertainty, how we balance competing priorities, and how we assess and respond to risk. Because those are challenges we still face today, and they're challenges that, if not properly addressed, can still lead to disaster. The Titanic, then, is not just a historical tragedy. It's a mirror that reflects our own decision-making processes, our own risk assessments, our own balancing of competing priorities. And by looking into that mirror, by understanding the complex factors that led to that Titanic disaster, we can perhaps make better decisions, assess risk more accurately, and balance priorities more wisely. And that perhaps is the most important legacy of the Titanic, not just as a cautionary tale of hubris, but as a complex case study in how multiple factors can come together to create disaster, and how human decisions can either mitigate or exacerbate those factors. So, as we continue to be fascinated by the story of the Titanic, let's remember that it's not just a story about an iceberg. It's a story about human decision-making, about risk assessment, about the balancing of competing priorities. And it's a story that, more than a century later, still has important lessons to teach us.